Hello, hello. This is Phoenix Apotheosis. I want to make a brief video about two things today. One, race, and how we can understand race ontologically and metaphysically and spiritually. And two, evolution and progress, and how our concepts of these things determine our future and how they interact with race. So let's begin. Most people in polite society today, an educated society, informed by postmodern scholarship and thinking, will simply say race is a social construct, and therefore, because it is a construct, it is relative, and therefore does not have true significance. And therefore, we should disregard racial considerations. We should not entertain a discourse that is investigating race, and instead we should focus on other things. Namely, we should learn to become better servants of the consumer capitalist corporate system, the globalist system. The second consideration is the idea of evolution, which is spelled out in front of us, so that we are led to believe that evolution is a matter of continual progress towards a universal state, a universal and objective truth that is beyond the subject itself, a singularity, if you will, or a transcendental object of sorts, and that we are moving towards this. And as we move towards this objective truth, this universal state, we are transcending differences and moving closer to so-called unity and dissolving our distinctions into a more primordial integrated state. In other words, our distinctions are being erased and transformed, allowing us to move into a higher state of integration. And so most progressives think of themselves as morally superior in so much as they are aligned with the future. They're aligned with progress. They're aligned in the direction in which we're moving. And therefore, they are smarter, they are more perceptive, and that in fact, all of their oppositions are fundamentally misled, holding on to the past, unable to let go, unable to recognize the pattern, the trend of moving forward. And I'd like to note that these two ideas of race as a construct and evolution as this movement towards universalism are both deeply linked. And what they're linked to is in fact entropy. What do I mean by that? Well, entropy is a law of thermodynamics that states that any system is always going to move towards a higher state of disorder that is characterized by an increased number of microstates within its boundary condition. And as more microstates increase, that system is moving towards the highest state of its own probability, achieving an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is characterized by increased amounts of chaos or disorder. And as entropy increases and these increased amounts of microstates form, it takes more energy to do less work within that system. So as entropy increases, more and more energy is needed to maintain the status quo within that system. And the reason I am bringing entropy into this at all, into this domain of cognition and effectively social science, is because we notice that entropy holds sway in the realm of information theory and statistics. So we need to look at information as this fundamental ground level of reality, and phenomena as such as the flowering of different informational states that converge upon one another. Okay. So we have a concept of race that says it doesn't matter because it's a construct. And if we look at that more closely, that sort of falls apart on itself. And not merely because of the biological determinist arguments that could be made, which is that how could you say it's a social construct? Race has to do with our genes and our biology. We can empirically test it. We can see that different races have fundamentally different characteristics, different traits, different neurology, different marrow, that there are concrete and material differences between race that are far beyond just skin color. And the same could be true for different breeds or subspecies of many different animal groups. But the interesting thing here isn't that race has some type of absolute and inherent or independent value, but it is a way of negotiating ourselves and our human existence within the domain of entropy that is constantly increasing within the wider system, that is constantly expanding no matter what in the forward direction of time. So race is an expression of the necessity to distinguish ourselves and to differentiate ourselves as individuals, but also as communities and cultural groups in order to counter the entropy which leads us into higher states of complexity and disorder. Complexity and disorder that is mistaken by liberal progressives today for progress and evolution. But all of this is just a careful play on words, because if we look at evolution more closely, we realize what is really meant is not entropy, but extropy, which is the intelligent and dynamic negentropic or negative entropy that life must develop in order to maintain order, which is effectively a lower state of entropy density within a system. So a more complex, higher order being is going to have a much lower entropy density than a simple form, because it is able to integrate itself. But what that really is saying is that a certain amount of cohesion is able to develop within that system, and that has to do with maintaining a degree of simplicity internally that in fact liberates energy. So less energy is required to do more work. And as this happens, we slide into the scale of negative entropy, which could be thought of as moving against the current of time. And this is where we arrive at the idea of a negative temporality, or an upward current, or going against the current, I should say, characteristic of many philosophical and esoteric schools of thought. But without diverging too much in that direction, we should talk about how race is an expression of maintaining a lower entropy state on a collective level by reducing the number of internal microstates within the system. And coincidingly, it is something very spiritual, because it is a means by which we can maintain order in the wider context of ever-expanding entropy. And by doing this, we renew ourselves and continue ourselves to higher and more complex states that disintegrate in the face of endless admixture and integration without restraint. So if we continue to engage with this thought process, we'll realize that negative entropy or extropy requires a boundary condition. It requires a border. It requires an enclosure, no different than a cell. A cell can only function because of the charge differential between the inside and the outside of the cell wall. On the inside of the cell wall, there is a slight negative voltage relative to the outside. And it is that differential that helps to determine the structure and the coherence and the integrity of that cell. If that cell is neutralized, so to speak, due to its ion gates opening, in which positive ions move into the cell and dilate the cell so that there's no longer as much of a polarized difference between the interior and the exterior context. That cell gets inflamed and it can ultimately degenerate. Okay? And human cultures are no different. We could think of this metaphysically in the domain of what is not material but still determinative in terms of our culture, our language, our world of thought and discourse. But of course, we can also look at this biologically and physically. If we do not maintain a certain critical differential between ourselves and our environment, we lose our distinction and we depolarize, and the integrity of our system breaks down. So this polarized potential that I'm discussing can be thought of as the core of what identity really means, and ultimately informs our understanding of what race really is in the first place, which is how, as a biological entity, we are able to find continuity in time, to retain our memory, which is ultimately the integrity of our morphology and the morphic, abstract, geometrical space that allows us to come into being. But also, it is a matter of maintaining resistance in the face of entropy. The more that we integrate and lose our sense of difference, which comes from our ability to maintain the continuity of our memory, the more we will effectively degrade and degenerate psychologically, physically, and metaphysically. So race is something that holds the key to achieving higher states of order, of social organization, of economic organization, of political organization, and so on. And it is ultimately the key to understanding what progress really means in terms of being able to develop into higher order beings with more subtle, more nuanced, and more complex culture. If instead we take for evolution the constant movement towards a universal integration of beings into a common soup, we're basically reflecting and understanding that being or truth is merely the lowest common denominator of beings and what is most common to beings, rather than what is most unique and that which distinguishes beings. And if we make this shift in our thinking from understanding being or truth or something, from being what is this common universal element, and instead realize it's this aspect of beings that allows us to pronounce our uniqueness and which allows us to differentiate ourselves, then we can come to the conclusion that all order, all extropy, the low entropy states that are necessary for life to continue and to thrive, are based in distinction, are based in our ability to honor our distinctions and to preserve our differences. And this becomes perhaps one of the most important spiritual principles around which any community can organize itself. And if this is lost, then we resort to the lowest common denominator, which is nothing honorable, nothing differentiating, nothing that distinguishes us, but instead the fact that we sleep, we shit, we eat, and we die, which is common to all. But no beautiful order, no higher form of integrity comes from what is most common, but through the struggle of self-distinction. And it is that struggle which manifests the entropy in the first place. And it is that struggle that is the experience of that polarized tension that upholds the integrity of the system. So in conclusion, we have to realize that race is not something that we're just given or that we have, but it's something that we have to struggle for, that we have to cultivate through mindfulness, through the preservation of our memory, through striving forward towards higher versions of ourselves with respect towards our memory and towards our ancestors and our community. And that it is a task of the cultivation of our own distinction. It is a form of resisting the flattening of the species into a soup of entropy. And on this basis, we must redefine our concept of progress. George Orwell famously said that whoever controls the present controls the past. But whoever controls the past controls the future. But I'd like to say, and I'd like to add to that very accurate statement, that whoever controls the future, in fact, controls the present, because it is our vision of tomorrow and what will be and what should be and how it will be that organizes how we are going to respond today. And how we are going to anticipate the future shapes the way that the future is going to unfold. So we have a temporal loop from the present to the past to the future back to the present. And this is how we must understand race. And the perfection of this knowledge is what defines our capacity to evolve. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, follow me on X at Phoenix Apotheosis.